How would you sum up the argument in your book?
The House of Islam is on fire and the arsonists still live within the House of Islam. So my book is a clarion call for a global village that we live in now of Muslims and people of other faith to help put out this fire, because there are almost 2 billion Muslims around the world. And unless the House of Islam is reinstated to its previous glory of kindness, compassion, mercy, art, calligraphy, beauty, admiring divinity internally and externally, what we'll have is more and more extremists and terrorists and suicide bombers coming out of our house. And as a Muslim and as a Westerner and as a human being, I can't sleep at night with a clear conscience knowing that this is the world that we're about to unleash in decades to come.
And when you say the House of Islam is on fire, the fire is extremism, terrorism, yes?
Absolutely right. But extremism and terrorism are interpretations and are tactics to achieve a strategic goal, an idea, a big aim. And that big idea is recreating this imagined caliphate or an Islamic state that's expansionist, that wants to conquer new territory, regain Spain, regain India, destroy Israel. They target New York, they target London. I mean, we may call it utopian and fantastical, but in many people's mind, it's a reality, and that's what drives the terrorism.
And your argument is that while some of the young men drawn into this, and they are mostly young men, might believe that this is some sort of return to Islam's traditions and history, that's just not the case.
1,400 years proves that that's not the case. And that's what I try to do in the House of Islam, a global history, is to illustrate that that's an imagination that never occurred. I mean, just look at the very early days of Islam. The Prophet Muhammad, for example, stood up for a Jewish wedding. He goes to Medina, says, Ya ayyuhan nas, O people, not just addressing Muslims. His grandson is killed by this so-called caliphate. I mean, the history is long and bloody, and I highlight that there was never this kind of one great glorious state. At one point in Muslim history, you had an Umayyad caliphate in Spain, you had a caliphate in Damascus, and then you had others emerging in other parts of the world, be it in Africa, Indonesia, indeed in Turkey. So there was never this. It's almost Nazi-like, fascist-like to say, you know, one leader for one people and one government. I mean, I think that's where we got it from, that kind of fascist 1920s and Nazi 1930s that influenced the formation of the movements, Hizb ut-Tahrir and the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and a whole range of others that now want to recreate this, as you say, an imagined past of Muslim domination over everybody else.
I mean, just to take that comparison, because obviously it's the most extreme comparison anybody can ever make, to say it's Nazi-like, it's fascist, it's like Hitler. I mean, the very fact of having a leader of a religion isn't itself fascist, is it? Any more than having a pope or, you know, any other leader of any other organized religion?
No, but as you correctly put it, a leader of a religion. Now, every religious adherent has a leader, whether it's their imam at the local mosque or whether it's a leader of a small religious organization. The Shia have a marja. Most Muslims who are from a Sufi order have a sheikh. So that leadership exists at this beautiful local level. We don't have to be centralized and fascist. And I mean, I don't shy away from the fact that I call them fascists because the Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood, was founded in 1928. That's 10 years after the Bolshevik Revolution. Hizb ut-Tahrir was founded in 1953. In between, others were founded, and they were all inspired by, and Gilles Kepel and other academics prove this, inspired by the European movements at that time. And you know, you read Muslim history, and there isn't this obsession with the state or statism in a way that you find in modern Islam, or modern Islamism, I should say, because it really was an influence from Lenin and Trotsky and Antonio Gramsci and others who are the luminaries of far-left Marxist thought. That then, I mean, Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, admired Mussolini. There is this proven track record that they looked to Germany and Italy for inspiration on how you do mass politics, populist movements, salvation, cut out the middle space, talk for an entire people, and then confront, you know, the capitalism, the West, the Jews, all of that rhetoric. And by the way, you know, it's interesting when the Russian Empire was lost, we had communism emerging in what then became Soviet Union. When the Germans lost the First World War and empire, we had Nazism emerge in Germany and then across other European countries. When the Ottoman Empire was lost, one of the greatest empires, a 700-year-old dynasty, people don't stop to ask, well, what happened when the Ottoman Empire and 22 plus other states were created from it in the Middle East? Well, it gave us the fascism that is today's jihadism and Islamism. So the loss of great empires and the humiliation of great peoples often leads to this extreme reaction and these charismatic leaders who promise salvation in this world and the next world and the reinstating of dignity and the ending of humiliation.
So who are the arsonists? Are the arsonists the leaders of extreme groups, or are they the foot soldiers, the people who get drawn in and become radicalized?
The arsonists are the advocates of the idea of a totalitarian state that want to remove every single Muslim and Arab government and recreate one state for one people with one leader for the whole world. And anyone who advocates that kind of a totalitarian worldview is an intellectual arsonist. And that fire that's been lit within the House of Islam is doing immense damage. And it kills more Muslims than it does more Muslims. ISIS killed more Muslims because Muslims disagreed with ISIS. And then it turned on the West. 9/11 visited New York after 20 years of the jihad in Afghanistan, where the same people fighting against the Russians wanted to turn Afghanistan into this kind of totalitarian state, which they successfully did.
If you want to change this world, how do you want to change it?
I think you change the world in the way in which the world has been changed previously. And by the way, I think changing the world is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. And the greatest philosophers and the greatest prophets did exactly that. They called humans to an ideal and to being better. And the way in which the world was changed previously and the way it should be changed now, and the way I think we should all try to change it, is by speaking the truth and by seeking justice, whether it was Plato's Republic that talked about truth and justice in chapter 1, or whether it's the Quran, or whether it's the holy scriptures of almost every religion, not almost, no, all religions talk about justice and truth.
But is there ever a truth when it comes to a religion? It's all different versions of well, some people call it the truth, some people call it fairy tales, whatever you think it is. There can't ever be a truth, can there?
There can be a truth. I'm not saying the truth, capital T, the and capital T truth, but there are truths and they resonate within us. One of the most beautiful moments is when, a desert Arab comes to the Prophet Muhammad and asks him a question, seeks truth. And the Prophet beautifully says, "Istafti qalbak," ask your heart. And that's what truth is. When something resonates inside of us and gives us a serenity and a calmness, that's truth. Whether it's your child, whether it's your mother, whether it's a religious truth, whether it's the divine within us and that resonates externally for religious people, that's truth.
The basic problem we have when having this conversation, and we've been having it for almost 20 years, I guess, in the media, is are those extremists, whoever's in ISIS right now, or Al-Qaeda, or whichever group you might be talking about, are they Muslims?
In my view, if someone is killing other human beings and killing themselves, so both suicide and murder are fundamental prohibitions in Islam. You violate both of those, you're no longer Muslim. Those who are shocked by that should ask themselves if, for example, a Muslim has a ham sandwich in public and says, "Oh, I'm allowed to have a ham sandwich," or even if has an alcoholic drink and says, "Oh, I'm religiously allowed to have an alcoholic drink." The extremists, ISIS and others, say immediately, "Oh, you're not Muslim," and they want to kill them. They want to kill ordinary Muslims, and they've done that. We saw that in the 3 or 4 years that they had the caliphate. Now, they, i.e. ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the other extremists, they violate 2 prohibitions. Suicide is prohibited in the Quran. Killing innocents is prohibited in the Quran. They violate both. And we, the mainstream majority, moderate, say, "Oh, yes, you're still Muslim." No, you're not. And I say that based both on logic, but also scripture. Historically, tens of Muslim scholars said they're not Muslims. What's the benefit of saying that? The benefit of saying that is young Muslims in Leicester, Keighley, and the rest of the world will no longer contemplate walking that extremist pathway as one option among many, because that's the current situation, right? I mean, you can be an extremist Muslim, but you're still a Muslim. Some would argue more authentic, the more extreme.
So you want to change that to you're not an extremist Muslim, you're just an extremist.
You're an extremist radical murderer. You're not a martyr if you die, you're a murderer.
I think we need to sort of wind back to your own experience and your own adolescence at this point, because we need to understand what draws in young people to this kind of ideology, and therefore what could counter it at that stage. So do you remember, you know, the period, the moment of being radicalized, you know, and sort of what was the convincing thing?
Yeah.
Because most people just don't understand it. To most people, it's just mad.
Yeah. Several things happen. In my case, you know, it was what happened in Bosnia, where white, blonde, blue-eyed Muslims were being killed in their thousands. And, you know, we here in the UK weren't doing anything much. And this is in the mid-1990s. And I wanted to know what should be the route of minimizing suffering out there. And I was only about 18 at the time. And I think it's the right thing to do. You know, you're young, you're an idealist, and you want to bring an end to injustice and suffering. And nobody could provide an answer to me as to how do you stop the slaughter of innocent Muslims in Bosnia. And I remember going to a lecture at the London School of Economics, and there the gentleman who was speaking, Umar Bakri Muhammad, who's now in Lebanon, then the founder of Hizb ut-Tahrir, and then he became a prominent jihadist, supporting ISIS and whatnot. It was he who then gave us a very clear solution that the problem is political. It's not about raising funds and sending blankets. You need a political solution. You need a state, a government that has an army to fight the Serbs and others who are fighting Muslims. And to the mind of an 18-year-old, that seemed like a perfect solution to a problem that no one else could give me a solution to. That an army is fighting an army, you need another army to fight it, and the army needs to be controlled by a caliph or a head of a Muslim state. And to pursue that, you've got to remove the barriers, and the barriers are the current Muslim governments. So signing up to that narrative of remove every Muslim government, create one government, the armies are then united, and then you fight our enemies in Israel, Palestine, Bosnia, Kashmir. The list is long. To an 18-year-old mind, 17-year-old mind, that was convincing. It lasted for about 2.5 years before I saw through it, and I kind of moved on to other organizations that were less extreme. But that's how it works.
Did you think you were gullible? Were you naive? Were you, ignorant? What was
No, I think there was an element of teenage naivety involved. And I think there was also an aspiration of wanting to end injustice. And I think that's
So what, do you think it was a rational response by you as a teenager to what you were hearing?
Yeah.
Or in retrospect, do you think, how on earth did I not see that he was crazy?
No. He and the organization, they weren't crazy at that time. They genuinely weren't. I mean, by the way, most extremists aren't crazy. They're not mad people. I mean, just look at the leadership of even the terrorist organizations. They tend to be mostly intelligent, educated, either engineers or doctors who approach scripture as kind of a manual of do's and don'ts, literalist instruction. So it didn't strike me as crazy. And, millions of people who vote for the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, after the Arab uprisings, weren't crazy, because the solution, al-Islam huwa al-hal in Arabic, that Islam is the solution, as they put it, it's attractive to a believer. It's attractive to those who want a sense of clarity in the difficulties of the world. And that's why I say it's also incumbent on people of other faiths and no faiths to be involved in this debate, because it's not just about what goes on inside Islam and Muslim communities. One of the reasons I left was I had long and extended conversations with an American feminist atheist friend of mine that held up her mirror. Another reason I left was because of my parents having deep disagreements about the way in which I had become a complete politicized activist. So yes, Bosnia agitated me and Palestine annoyed me, but my response wasn't to turn to God and be pious. I had become a very, very political a heavily political individual that, my father would wake up in the morning to pray and be pious, and I'd come home late from distributing leaflets and organizing a public speaking that I couldn't pray. I was too busy asleep, and I missed my morning prayers. So that kind of contrast between my father's form of pietistic, contemplative Islam and my more activist Islam made me think where was I heading. Conversations with non-Muslims helped immensely. And by the way, I remember being thrown out of my local mosque on multiple occasions. It was Muslims at my local mosque, both in Brick Lane and then later in Stepney and Poplar, all in the East End, heavy Muslim presence, that just did not believe that there was any need for a caliphate or any pursuit of a caliphate, and they didn't like us attacking the Conservatives, the Labour Party, and attacking Muslim governments. They said, this is a mosque, it's a place of worship, get out. And that's exactly what they did to us again and again. They threw us out. And that made me think and think and think again as to, I'm supposed to be the kind of, mobilizer, organizer of the Muslim cause, as I imagined it to be, Muslim liberation, and yet Muslims don't want to have anything to do with it.
So weren't they doing the right thing?
I think they were.
By throwing you out?
In hindsight, yes.
Because that's what you want them to do now.
I think that, I do.
But it didn't work with you, is the point.
Well, it did. I left. Of course, it worked. I left because if you don't have that platform inside the mosque, inside the Muslim space on university campuses and in community centers, and Muslims just saying no to the caliphate, no to the extremism, no to the hatred of Israel, no to the hatred of non-Muslims, no to attacking and disliking other Muslims, which is their message. For how much longer do you sustain that? And over a period of time, there's not a kind of a immediate moment, but over a period of time, you think, you rethink,
those messages worked.
Yeah, they trickle down, and you lose your base. And incidentally, that happens now across most Muslim countries. I mean, you can't just walk up in a mosque and organize a rally in Cairo, or in Saudi Arabia or other parts of the Muslim world. You will get thrown out if those messages are echoed. I mean, there is the other argument that that's too heavy-handed, and you drive the argument underground, which is another concern.
But that is the key concern, isn't it? That in all of these communities, young people are coming up with these extremist propositions, being told no, that's wrong by community leaders or elders or parents with whom they don't relate, and then they go off to fight a war in Syria or Iraq and do it that way. They do it themselves. So what I'm saying to you is, if your basic proposition is community leaders, elders, imams should be spreading the right message, these days, does that work? Don't people just get on a plane anyway and go and pick up a Kalashnikov?
Good luck to them, because they'll then find other Kalashnikovs waiting for them. We should have the courage of our convictions to say, let them go. If you want to go and kill British soldiers and our allies in the Middle East, the heaviest hand of our allies will be dealt, and we've seen Jihadi John and others killed in that process. If we don't have the conviction in saying that now, that if you want to go and fight and kill and be killed, go and be killed.
Well, because also that involves us being involved in the fight, doesn't it?
But and we should be, but don't bring innocent Islam and innocent Muslims into all of this. Right now, the good name of Islam is being tarnished. A civilization and 1.7 billion people daily are having to face headlines of negativity with which they can't relate.
It is a religion that can sanction killing, isn't it?
Well, depends on the context.
But that's the problem, right, isn't it? Because if you what you say is murder, they say is a just
we believe
killing.
We believe, when I say we as Muslims, we believe in just war theory. The millions of Muslims from India that fought the Nazis did so with conviction that it was evil and it was right to kill Hitler and Hitler's Nazi soldiers. Germany and Nazism posed a genuine threat to peace, love, kindness, human compassion, and civilizational order. And as Edmund Burke says, unless you take up the sword to take the sword out of the hands of madmen, then evil spreads. So on that argument of natural justice, natural war theory, just war theory, but more specifically looking at the way in which Muslims fought the Nazis, it's the right thing to do. When evil looks at you, you don't dialogue with evil. You've got to take up arms. So in that kind of context, I think we would all agree that's what a military response is.
But that's not the only context, is it?
But I'm talking about vigilante violence here. We're talking about vigilante violence here, where individuals from the streets of Cairo or Saudi Arabia, or here indeed in the United Kingdom, are deciding for themselves that killing themselves and killing others in the pursuit of some caliphate is somehow sanctioned by Islam. It isn't.
Your certainty that what they are doing is not Islamic starts to become difficult when you talk to them.
On their side, what they have is what they consider to be the truth, and they have total certainty in that. Now, on our side, unless we have the equal amount of certainty, we can't puncture their arguments on the other side by being nice, liberal, moral relativists.
What I'm questioning is whether you can ever puncture their arguments, because they believe what they are doing. It's not a rational thing for them.
It's actually fully rational for them, yeah. They're rational actors. They're not stupid.
No,
they're
but
very intelligent.
It's based on a faith, isn't it? It's based on a belief. or a brainwashing or whatever it might be.
Yeah, but it's rational because they believe in texts, they believe in acting out what it says in the texts, and they have strong beliefs that, right, in the modern West, beliefs no longer have rational value, but across the Muslim world, to believe in one God is rational. And for most believing Muslims, to believe in a creator, therefore creation is rational. The creator gives you commands, that's rational. You act on those commands for a better world. For them, that's a form of a rational argument. And as a Muslim, to me, that's a rational argument. Now, Islam fundamentally, and this is based on 1,000 years of scholarship. Islam was about what they call the maqasid, preserving a few things in life. And everything else is a tactic or a method to preserving the following. One, the preservation of life. 2, the preservation of religious practice. 3, the enhancement of the intellect. 4, private property, interestingly, private property. And 5, the family, ensuring that the family unit was protected and we knew who our children were and so on. All the other stuff, whether it's the fighting or whether it's the amputating of arms or whether it's the stoning of homosexuals and all of that the baggage that's been built over time, the cultural nonsense, all of that is aimed to preserve those 5 things. Now, in the modern world, all of those 5 things are preserved across the West. Where they're not preserved is in China, where Muslims can't preserve their own religious freedom. So if you want an enemy, ordinary radical, go after China. The problem isn't here in the West, where we as Muslims are in complete accordance with our 5 maqasid that have been the Muslim mainstay for 1,000 years.
I mean, it's interesting because what it takes us to is the question of whether fighting from within the religion is better than fighting from secular values. Fighting extremism from a position of, well, we're all secular now, doesn't seem to be working, because this is precisely what they hate. And what you're saying is you can fight it from within Islam.
Absolutely. And I say that with complete conviction for 2 reasons. One, we've seen the French laicity-based response. And everywhere that French model has gone of extreme French laicity-type secularism, whether it's in Turkey or whether it's indeed in France itself, there's always a reaction from people of faith because John Gray writes about this brilliantly in his books, that whatever we think of religious people and God, and however difficult it is for extreme secularists in the world, in the modern West to accept that, it's a reality out there. Most people believe in God and want a religious space in which they can express themselves. Now, to say to those people, you've got to abandon God, abandon text, abandon religion, and it's only the Rousseau or the Voltaire worldview from the French Revolution and the Enlightenment that you must embrace and absorb. It's just extremes fighting extremes. I think the colorful middle ground of sense is to draw on the strong tools that we have within Islam to expel the arguments and to sideline the extremism that exists inside Islam. And it can be done, and it's happening now in Saudi Arabia, in Libya, in Egypt, in Qatar, Bahrain, in many countries of the world. This argument is underway.
But are you saying that if this argument is pursued, extremism will just wither under the force of argument?
Well, not just the force of argument, but the force of force. Throughout Muslim history, there has always been the rising of these extremists, and the proverbial lawn has always been mown by Muslims. Always happened. Even when the Ottomans.
But are you saying that moderates? I mean, I hate the phrase moderate Muslim. I don't know what the correct phrase is. But are you saying Muslims like you will end up fighting these extremists who you believe are no longer Muslims and kill them off?
What do you think happened to ISIS? It was the Iraqi army that killed them.
How many of them are dead is the question. I mean, or how many of them have melted away?
Well, they've killed as many of them as possible. I mean, look at the Al-Qaeda presence in Saudi Arabia. Why did it go away in 2 years? In 2004, 2003, bin Laden's operatives were unleashing weekly bombings in.
So you think it can be literally snuffed out?
It's snuffed out through 2 things: using force and killing those who wish to kill you, and 2, winning the battle of arguments.
You're saying things that a lot of people would be too scared to say. You've been saying this for years. I mean, how is it that you haven't been targeted yet?
I'm a believer in God, and I believe that God protects you.
Really?
And absolutely, yeah, I have no doubts about that. I wouldn't do this if I didn't have a sense of conviction that this is the right thing to do by my Creator, by my faith, by my own conscience, and by my family, and by innocent Muslims who have to stand by and watch their faith and their community and their reputations being sullied daily with the blood of the extremists. Their extremism is that raises levels of quote unquote Islamophobia, and you don't change the world by being quiet. And I also feel rewarded that the work I've done has resulted in actions on the part of others that has led to more and more rejection of the extremism and the terrorism, and that can only be a good thing. You
and the colleagues who've had similar stories as yours, who launched the Quilliam Foundation, which is this sort of anti-radicalisation think tank, come under a lot of attack as well as sort of, bought and paid for activists, instruments of the state, spies, whatever it might be. Presumably you have no problem with working with the state either, the state that you support and want to strengthen. Well, so, I mean, that criticism doesn't really work with you, does it? Because you don't have a problem with being an instrument of the state.
But firstly, I'm not an instrument of the state. I just am not. I've never held a government position. I've advised governments, both here and around the world, but I despise bureaucracy. I cannot work in government departments. So just on a very practical level, I won't make a good civil servant. So that hasn't happened, and it won't happen. But I mean, the state, whether you use a Weberian definition or even if you go back to Hobbes, its basic responsibility is to provide security for its citizens. Between the Labour Party and the Tories and everyone else, you can disagree on, big government, small government. But no one disagrees with the very basic necessity of government is to provide security for its citizens. As a Muslim, one of the maqasid of the Sharia, one of the aims of the Sharia is to provide security for people. Once that is threatened, it's incumbent upon me as a Muslim to react to that. So you're right. I mean, accusations of working for the state are very shallow, because I don't work for the state. I work for my own conscience as a Muslim to make sure that humans are safe, that we can wake up in the morning, get on the train and not feel that another human in the name of my religion will be attempting to attack people. So providing security is one of the greatest services that any human being with a civil and a faith-based conscience can do.
Well, one of the other big arguments you're making is on a much bigger level, is this idea of a Middle East union. What is that? And what would it do?
I again take this from arguments that I've heard from friends and people in government and in civil society and media people in the Middle East for the last 20 to 30 years. I travel there often, and what you always hear is that the Europeans had wars for centuries and they killed each other over religion and extremism. We're doing something similar now. The European Union was a peace project. The Europeans have tens of languages and many serious ethnic and kind of nationalistic differences. We only have one or two at top three major languages, and we have a common history and a common culture and a common faith for most of us. We have common challenges in the Middle East, be it youth unemployment, the youth bulge, water shortage, wars between borders, the rise of extremism across borders. And all of those require a common response. No one state can solve it. And therefore, what we need is some kind of architecture that allows for governments to come together, governments to respond together, governments to work together. So I'll give you a very small example. In Libya, where there's almost a civil war at play, they have a huge sovereign wealth fund and vast amounts of capital, but not enough expertise or labor. Across the border in Egypt, they've got vast amount of labor, but not enough capital. Those dots aren't being joined at the moment. And where they are joined, you see prosperity, i.e. the United Arab Emirates. It's a union of nations. In Saudi Arabia, Hijaz and Najd, there's a union of nations. So it's a call, just as in the thickness of war in the 1930s, there were intellectuals who looked beyond the daily grind of headlines and war and saw Germany, France and others working together to create the European Union. In the thick of the sectarianism and the mutual hatred that exists across the region, I think it's incumbent for some of us to rise above it and say, what does the future 25, 30 years later look like from now for our allies in the Middle East, and creating some form of an architecture for a Middle East union between independent nations is the way forward.
Who would be in it? Everyone in the Middle East. I mean, Iran and Saudi Arabia in a union together?
But the European Union didn't start with Britain in it. and didn't start with other nations in it. It started primarily as a union between the two big movers, i.e. France and the steel union between France and Germany. And I don't want to be too prescriptive for what people in the region want, and it's their choice. But there's been a lot of talk between our allies, the Saudis, the Bahrainis, the Emiratis, the Kuwaitis, and Egypt, for example, in the last 2 or 3 years, and to some extent Jordan. I mean, those are countries that might be ideal candidates. But what we've got to realize is that there's a fundamental fault line across the region now. And what unites these nations against others is there is this pursuit of the Islamist ideology, i.e. Iran's export of its form of Islamism and extremism. So for as long as Iran remains a fascist state, it's hard, I think, for the Saudis and others to say, oh, yes, you can export your revolutionary totalitarianism, but we'll work with you on other issues. So there's good reason why the Emiratis and the Saudis refuse to work with Iran. So what this does is it builds our allies, and it forces the Iranian opposition and others to rid themselves of the fascist government that they have in Tehran. So, but to do that, they've got to have a better vision, something to look forward to. And I say this, that unless we in the West and our allies get behind a grand project, a big idea and new vision for the Middle East, what we saw with ISIS, I mean, the clue's in the name, right? Iraq and Syria.
So when you write your plan on the back of an envelope as to how to change the world your way, what is required to turn your vision into a reality?
I mean, I don't want to sound as though it's mine, because it's not mine.
You're articulating something in this book, and you've laid it out today quite clearly as to sort of what you think should happen. So I'm just wondering, sort of, who needs to join in?
The West and moderate elements within the West, right-thinking people in the West. I also think that we have allies in the Muslim world that look to us, especially to Britain, by the way. I mean, we often forget that Britain is venerated deeply in monarchies of the Muslim world because of a 1,000-year-old British monarchy here, and religious leaders who are sensible. And then what's required is investment in the big ideas. But before getting to the details of how it works out, what's required is buying in. And what's required is conviction and winning the argument. And I think that's where we're currently at, that once the argument is won that you need to defeat the idea of calling for a caliphate and destroying all Muslim governments, once the argument is won that extremists who are in fact terrorists and want to kill themselves and kill others in the process must be expelled or sent to the battlefield, and once the argument is won that you need a new Middle East that's broadly pluralist and secular in the Anglo-Saxon model and believes in free trade and the free movement of capital and people, and rids itself of the extremist baggage, then what you see is governments and others come forward with the detailed policy plans. So, I'm not a bureaucrat. It's not for me to sit here and say this is how we do it. I also think that's quite fascist. But what I am, I think, is someone who's putting an argument out there and let the strongest argument win and the best vision win.
I mean, the third bit of that, sort of what the Middle East should be, sort of a secular Anglo-Saxon trading bloc of the world. I mean, that's a huge proposition, isn't it?
Why?
Because the kind of change that will be required across the Middle East to deliver that is sort of unimaginable.
The Prophet Muhammad was a businessman. Muslims rejoice in that. It's a civilization built on the Silk Roads. So
democracy doesn't matter there, or does it?
I think when we make demands for democracy, it's almost as though we're making the old Greek argument that you're either a democrat and civilized Greek or you're a barbarian. I think there are shades of grey in the Muslim world.
So benevolent dictations.
No, I wouldn't use that kind of language. I would make the rule of law and free trade between nations our first objectives. I have the good fortune of meeting with princes in the Middle East who are, I don't want to use the language that you use, but they're in power. And what I detect is an impulse for reform. What they don't like is revolutions. Now, why do I mention the Anglosphere? Because we have a thinker called Edmund Burke who advocated exactly that. He opposed the French Revolution, but he ensured that the merchant class here in England, the monarchy, the religious establishment and others had a beautiful act of balancing that ensures that we are where we are today in the English-speaking world because of the thinking of someone like Edmund Burke. I think that kind of Burkean reform-oriented thought with the rule of law and free trade and other dynamic forces unleashed, rather than saying our first demand is democracy and you must be thrown off your political offices and all power to the street and the masses. We've seen that in Arab Spring, and it doesn't work. What you need is a much more Burkean, slow-moving, reform-oriented way in which you create prosperity for people, security for the state and the government, and in the cases of many Arab countries, monarchies. And then what happens is a slow reform process kicks in. And we're seeing that at play in countries such as Bahrain. And it can happen, and it should happen, and we should support that. The impulse of the current Saudi crown prince is a good impulse, rather than us saying, you've locked up X, Y, and Z, and therefore we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And it's just being a little bit more practical, drawing on our own history, understanding that Burkean small c conservative tradition of bringing about change, and having a better expectation of the people of the Middle East takes us to a better place, rather than where we are currently. Kind of every headline is about extremism and terrorism.
And so do you think they will ultimately do it themselves, these countries? Because Trump isn't going to do it, and European Union isn't going to do it, and Britain isn't going to do it now, are they? I mean, in terms of sort of helping these places change. All of the instincts of these governments is to withdraw.
No, I think the European Union's engagement has been much more long-lasting and deep, and trying to get the region into a much more stabilized place. But what's been missing is support from either the US, but something much bigger, and that's having that conversation on the table. Too often at the global summits, the conversation is all about security and terrorism. I mean, just look at the minutes that come out, and look at the declarations and the press releases and the announcements. It's all about our common pursuit of security and counterterrorism and intelligence cooperation. I mean, that just makes the entire region look like a hotbed of extremism, fanaticism, and all we're looking for is basically spies and oil, and as long as that's flowing, we don't really care. There's no deeper conversation based on, Islam's rich history and of art and beauty, which I bring out in the book to show that there is another way of being Muslim that was the historical norm.
You started out this conversation with this statement, that the House of Islam is on fire and the arsonists are still here. How confident are you that the house isn't going to burn down? I'm
confident. I mean, you made me think for a couple of seconds on that. If you look at the current trajectory, the house that's in the Middle East won't burn down because of extremism and terrorism, because Muslim governments and institutions are taking serious measures against the extremism and the terrorism, and most Muslims in the Middle East reject the terrorists because they are the victims of the terrorism. My concern is the fire spreading here in the West. Because what we have, for all the flaws of the Muslim world, is a normative default form of Islam as to what's right, what's wrong, what's truth, what's not. And that can be imposed through school curricula and universities and the media space, and there is authority in the Muslim world. But here in the West, where we have 30 million Muslims, there's a complete lack of authority. And the moral relativism of mainstream society impacts upon these ordinary Muslims. They're almost the orphans of Islam. Most of the 30 million Muslims have no kind of guidance as to where they go, what it means, and they have made Google their sheikh. You have a question, it's Sheikh of Google. You Google it and you find answers. Well, on Google, it's the loudest that speaks more clearly. And what we've got here is a real problem with young Muslims turning to YouTube, Google for a form of Islam and practicing that more extreme, confrontational, rigid Islamist extremism, rather than the Islam of our grandfathers, of the kind of Sufi, Mughal, Ottoman, pluralist, thoughtful, contemplative form of Islam. So this part of the House of Islam here in the West I worry about, and I'm not sure that unless we have a serious battle of ideas and win this battle of ideas, and we have a clarified sense of what it means to be a Westerner and a Muslim simultaneously, I worry about the future of Islam in the West more than I worry of the future of Islam in the East. And
to young Muslims here, in the West, where should they sit on going to the pub, having girlfriends and boyfriends, living like English kids or British kids?
See, this is the beauty of Islam. There are answers within Islam for all of those things without you losing your faith. I mean,
so you can drink? You can have sex?
You ask those questions as if Muslims aren't doing all of those things out there.
Of course they are.
Yeah, so they just, I'm not a mufti. It's not for me to pronounce on these things, but if someone wants to go to the pub and have an orange juice, it's their choice. The Turks, their national drink is an alcoholic drink. Though? I am a parent, and I have 2 daughters.
So your daughter's going to ask you these questions as well,
yes.
aren't they? So as a parent, what do you say?
Well, what's the question?
Is it okay to go and drink alcohol?
Well,
Can I still be a good Muslim?
My preference is, my darling daughter, that you don't drink alcohol, and these are the reasons for it. But you should go to the pub and you should meet with your colleagues and friends who do drink alcohol. But it's entirely your choice.
And what about all the sexual morality? You know, sort of whether it's the clothes they should wear, sex before marriage, approaches to marriage, all those sorts of things.
So all of those things are...
Because these are the things that young Muslims are wrestling with, aren't they?
So the real issue, and you know, I'm not a politician, so I can be completely honest. The real issue for Muslims at the moment, in terms of coming to understanding, is this whole gender changing issue. You know, that's where people of faith, no, not just Muslims, have to come to terms with, well, what does that mean? You know, if children come home and say, I'm no longer a boy, I'm a girl, I'm no longer a girl. You know, how do you then practice Sharia? Does it then mean the rulings for women applying to you or ruling for men? That's the frontier at which the struggle should be taking place, but it is not taking place. The greatest danger to our children in the West, by the way, isn't the ritualistic stuff, isn't the alcohol, or isn't the sex outside marriage, or isn't homosexuality. That's really not the biggest danger. The biggest danger, and we're not paying enough attention to this as someone of faith and Jewish, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, other friends, they're not paying attention to is the rise of this rabid materialist atheism in which our lives have become nihilistic. There's no meaning. God's, and Nietzsche's word, no, God's dead. And that form of extremism, evangelical extremism that's being imposed on us, positivist thought that you must have physical evidence that we with our minds can judge. Without that, there's no metaphysics. That's the real threat, that we lose our children to godlessness and the atheism that comes with it. And in that process, they lose their faith, they become nihilistic, and life has meaning no more. So that's the real threat. And the conversation currently isn't at that stage of the metaphysical and the pure and the beautiful and how you sustain that. The argument has instead become about these ritualistic things that, by the way, you know, they're very contested and debated. I highlighted to you the 5 maqasid things that Islam is all about, you know, preserving life and property and the family and the intellect and religious worship. That's what it's about. Everything else is detailed and contested.
If the choice is godlessness or extremism, which one are you going to take?
Well, that's the point. That should not be the choice. That should not be the choice. And sadly, that's become the choice. It's a great question, Krish. And that's become the choice. You're either going to be part of this, speaking crude terms, you know, atheist society, or you're going to be part of this colourful Muslim majority that doesn't make sense. So I'm going to become the extremist. You know, that should not be the choice, the extremes or godlessness. There is a beautiful, colourful middle ground that's been sustained by thousands of years of history across all civilizations. Why should we be so arrogant that we dismiss the Greeks, the Romans, you know, the Babylonians, and even our own history? We're ashamed of it. You know, we should be proud of our past and be confident in what the future can hold.
Ed Husain, thank you very much indeed.